I just ran an awesome game for my friend and his 12-year-old son, and I've got a few tips on how to make running games for kids a little easier and a lot more fun. So I literally just wrapped up running a playtest game for an adventure that I'm making for my game, Teenage Mutant Tunnel Goons. It is a Ninja Turtle-inspired hack of Nate Tremay's Tunnel Goons game. I played with my friend Andy and his 12-year-old son Ryden and had so much fun.
5. Okay.
So 9 total?
9.
You needed an 8.
What? He's
So
that little?
No, he is a cockroach.
Yeah.
So you got him, Katana.
Yeah.
So I'm releasing this adventure called Outbreak of the Animoids on my Patreon by the end of this month. If you sign up in August, you'll get the adventure. Also, as soon as you sign up, you'll have access to the digital version of the Teenage Mutant Tunnel Goons rules. I guess it should go without saying that a lot of the stuff that I make on my Patreon, in my online shop, is kid-friendly. I really love fun cartoons and colorful video games, and I think my writing and artwork reflect those inspirations pretty clearly. I guess I'd say that my imagination tends towards the whimsical instead of the dark and gritty, and because of that, I get asked all the time if I have any advice on how to run games for kids. And usually what I do is point people towards Ben Milton, aka Questing Beast, here on YouTube. He has a great article in, I believe it's the first issue of Knock magazine. If I can find a link, it'll be down in the description. Wonderful article about running games for kids. But now that I've actually run a game for a kid, I've got some advice, some tips and tricks that should make things just a little bit easier. And I should say, there's absolutely no reason to feel intimidated about running games for kids. If they're interested in playing, it's really not that much different than running for adults. And honestly, I think that any of the advice, any of the tips that I have in this video are actually good things to apply to your games with adults as well. So first things first, let's talk about the actual game rules. So I'm running a game based on Tunnel Goons, which is a really simple system. There's 3 stats. You're rolling 2d6 and adding your stat modifier, and then you get a +1 bonus for any inventory, and in this case, your mutation, like what kind of animal you're mutated from. And the great thing about Tunnel Goons versus a more complex or crunchy game like 5e, people are going to laugh at me for calling 5e crunchy, but compared to Tunnel Goons, it definitely is. But in Tunnel Goons, there's no like class abilities or like complex spell descriptions. You're never going to be reading paragraphs of stuff on your character sheet. Instead, the game just asks you to use your imagination and come up with abilities based on your equipment, or in the case of Teenage Mutant Tunnel Goons, on your mutation. So let's say you're a kangaroo mutant, and instead of having some jump ability that has been assigned to you because of that, where you get a proficiency bonus or like +3 to jumping. Instead, you just know that you're a kangaroo and you say, hey, I want to jump from this rooftop to the other. Because I'm a kangaroo, I should be good at jumping, so I get +1 to my roll for that. Now, of course, no system is perfect. Especially when it comes to kids, I think this can be good and bad. So at first, I think Ryden was a little bit shy and it was harder for him to improvise in the moment. But once Andy and I encouraged him a little bit, he actually opened up and his creativity started running wild. So like at one point, he had this Echo Blaster item that we hadn't defined any rules for. I just told him to write down Echo Blaster, and he thought, oh, maybe instead of, shooting a bad guy with it, he's gonna shoot the ground and blast himself into the air to avoid this charging mechanized elephant. Ended up being a super cool moment, and you could see the gears turning, and he was really excited about being creative and avoiding danger in this really fun and interesting way. So I want to go ahead and super recommend Tunnel Goons as a great way to play D&D like games with kids without the complexity of having to read a bunch of crazy abilities and stuff. Or maybe if the kids really want to play D&D, you can take the time to make characters with them, but not worry about all of the descriptions of the spells and stuff. They can still make a character with the bonuses and all that stuff, but just write down a spell name or an ability name and then just kind of let them decide on what that means in the moment. That actually sounds like a great way of playing D&D and having all of the cool character options and stuff, but not worrying about the mechanics. I guess that's what I'm saying. My tip is to not worry so much about the mechanics of the actual game. Okay, now let's talk about the actual adventure. I ran Outbreak of the Animoids. It was a one-shot, and with creating characters, which didn't take very long, it took about 3 hours to play, and I think maybe that was a little bit too long. I think something like 2 hours would have been better. I should have limited the number of encounters and maybe pointed them in a direction a little sooner. But because I was playtesting this adventure and they were both really excited about exploring all around this zoo map, I did kind of have to cut the final encounter way down. And it wasn't quite as epic as I wanted it to be just because we were running out of time. Now, I think it's super important to consider the attention span of the kids that you're playing with. But the good thing is it's really easy to tell when a kid is getting bored. So you can just fast forward moments. You can throw in shortcuts, or if a situation isn't as exciting as you thought it would be, throw in a random encounter. Honestly, I think the easiest way to not be boring is just to have them roll something. So Ryan was super excited to roll for stuff even when he didn't really need to. So I just let him roll away, you know? And I think that sort of leads into my next piece of advice, and that is to really, really make sure you're giving the player a chance to shine. So usually I would say something like, I would direct this to a player. I would say, how do you envision your character accomplishing this or whatever? But in this case, I would say, okay, Ryden, what is the coolest way your character can break this shield barrier? And here's the really important thing. So if a roll goes sideways, it isn't very good. So like at one point in the game, Ryden ended up rolling 3 1s in a row, like super bad rolls all in a row. But instead of it just being like a basic failure, like, oh, the enemy deflected your laser blast, well, this time the enemy deflected the laser blast and it bounced into a telephone pole and caused this huge explosion. So like, yeah, he didn't do any damage to the enemy, but he still made a huge explosion and it was still kind of cool. And it meant, oh, maybe next time when my laser actually hits, it'll do a lot of damage. Now, I was just playing with one kid, and I imagine playing with multiple kids would make it a little more difficult to make sure each of them has their moment to shine. But I think really it's about listening to what they think is cool, especially if you could find out beforehand, before you play, like, what do they really love, and then trying to get that in the game. So, like, Ryden has this pet bird, and they're playing this adventure in the zoo, so of course they end up at the aviary with all these birds around. So, of course, it was like, when they sort of saved the day in the aviary, this bird, Bobby, flew down and thanked them, and then Ryden instantly wanted to become friends with it, so I was like, sure, and Bobby ended up becoming the sort of like animal translator for the rest of the game. It was honestly the best part of this game was like just having a little bit of wish fulfillment, a little bit of fantasy fulfilled, and then it affects the entire game. It really makes it special. So the other thing I noticed is that, Ryden is a 12-year-old kid. He doesn't have the most life experience, or at least not as much as adults that I would usually be playing with. And so some things, take a little bit more explanation. I mean, luckily we were playing this zoo adventure and it's kind of based on the Cincinnati Zoo. And so he had gone there multiple times this summer. So he could imagine it very clearly. But in some cases where I had to explain a little bit more, that can get a little bit boring. So in the cases where, usually the players enter a new area and I spend a little bit of time, describe things so the players can decide how their characters would feel about it. I would just kind of skip that stuff and I'd say something like, in the cafe, It's been abandoned, the lights are flickering, the music playing over the speakers is distorted, and it just feels really spooky in here. And leave it at that. And I really think cutting down on the amount of description that I was giving, not only did it help move the game along a little bit faster, but it really just got the players interacting with the world and actually doing stuff in the world way, way faster. The other thing that really helped was having this map. The link to the video about making this map is popping up somewhere. You know, this is just a map of the zoo with the different locations that they could explore. This isn't like a fully gridded tactical battle map, but just having these visuals for Raiden to look at got him very excited to explore this zoo, almost to the point where he couldn't even decide where he wanted to go. And the really cool thing that actually really surprised me is that when we zoomed into one of the locations where you might think that having, you know, a gridded battle map would really help, I was genuinely surprised at how well he kind of kept all of the information in his head and was able to talk about like different enemies when a fight broke out. And you know, sometimes the theater of the mind stuff can get complex, but when it did get complex, he just kind of ignored it and said like, hey, I want to do this, and like, oh, maybe in a more complicated game, like he couldn't move that far. We just kind of ignored it when it got complicated, and it still worked really well. So we weren't using miniatures or anything like that. I mean, one thing that was kind of fun is like in the game, the mutants get their own bandana color. So like Andy had red dice and Raiden had purple dice. So any sort of tactile stuff I think is really important. Of course, he did the classic thing where he tried to stack all of the dice up as high as they could go. And really, if you want help making some abstract kind of maps that are good for this sort of thing, there's lots of videos on the channel that should help you. The other thing I did that I don't normally do and I think makes a really big difference is I did some character voices. So early on, the players, they met this cold-blooded python that's kind of like lazy going around the reptile house, and I didn't do a voice, and it wasn't the most engaging encounter. So when it came time for the next NPC, there was a sloth that was teleporting around. I started making weird nasally noises. I don't know what sloths sound like. I just made something up. And then they met this magpie that was kind of like just make weird voices. I don't know. It was really fun. And you know what? The other thing that really helped, we had a bunch of soda and candy, just eating snacks. It just makes things better. So yeah, I think it kind of goes without saying, but every kid is going to be different. So I think the most important advice I have is to sort of cater to what the kids think is exciting and interesting. So of course, Raiden really loved the big fights and making friends with the bird Bobby, but other kids might be into finding cool treasure or exploring spooky places or building up their base, their headquarters, or maybe they want to do funny voices and have fun acting with the different NPCs. And I think the great thing about running games with kids is that you can tell what they're interested in and what they're bored with really easily. And when things spark their imagination, they just light up. So it becomes really easy to adjust your game on the fly and get into having the most possible fun that you can. Okay, so let me know if you have any tips about running games for kids down in the comments. If you'd like to support the channel, you can get the digital version of Teenage Mutant Tunnel Goons by joining the Patreon. And if you join this month, you'll get the Outbreak of the Animoids adventure. I also have an online shop with all of my other adventures and guidebooks. Check that out. The link's in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. See ya!